He put up a hand and the music stopped. The spotlight caught the white of his suit, the gold of the microphone. In the front row, fans froze mid-scream. This was August 1977, just months before the end, and Elvis Presley, the king, was about to honor the friend he'd just lost. If you believe moments of kindness can echo for decades, stay with me to the end. This story of Elvis, loyalty, and loss will stay with you long after the music fades. The bass was thumping, brass section sharp and alive, stage lights swept the room like a restless tide. The Las Vegas Hilton showroom, mid-70s, was a wall of sound and heat. It smelled of perfumed cigarettes, and something sweet from the cocktail trays weaving through the aisles. Elvis Presley, in a gleaming white jumpsuit, stood center stage, gold microphone in hand, black hair slick under the stage lights. His hips kept the beat, but his eyes were scanning past the crowd, as if searching for something not there. Halfway through CC Rider, it happened. He lifted his left hand, just a small motion, but the band stopped mid-bar, cymbal crash hanging in the air. A guitar tech froze mid-step at the edge of the stage. The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't clap. The change in the air was too sudden. People leaned forward, some holding their breath as if afraid they'd miss whatever came next. Elvis looked down for a long moment, then up toward the spotlight haze. His voice, when it came, was quiet, low enough that ushers in the back leaned in to catch it. "This one's for a friend we lost. No name, no story, just that." A woman in the second row clasped her hands at her mouth. Someone else whispered, "Who?" The spotlight above Elvis caught the faint dust in the air, swirling like slow snow. His free hand tightened around the microphone stand. Behind him, the band waited. Musicians shifted, unsure. This wasn't on the set list taped to the floor. Some say you could hear the buzz of the amplifiers in that pause. Others remember the creak of the stage under his boots as he shifted his weight. And then, nothing. He didn't speak again right away. Didn't explain. Instead, he took a long, measured breath, eyes fixed somewhere above the lights. Somewhere only he could see. The tension was a living thing now. Even the waitresses stood still, drink trays balanced, not daring to move. It wasn't like Elvis to leave a silence hanging this long. Every show was tight, fast-paced and smooth. He missed nothing. He never missed a cue, which is why tonight, everyone knew, whatever this was, it mattered. Finally, he turned his head just slightly toward the drummer. A subtle nod, the kind that said, "Follow me." The drummer picked up a slow, steady beat, soft, almost funereal. Elvis stepped closer to the mic, the gold catching a hot white glare. And just before the first note left his lips, he glanced down at the front row, a row with one seat conspicuously empty. We didn't know it then, but that empty seat wasn't an accident. It was the first sign of a promise about to be kept. The scene shifts years earlier, late 1950s. Memphis. The air outside Sun's studio was thick with summer heat, the kind that clings to your shirt. Inside, cigarette smoke curled around the bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The faint hum of an amp filled the silence between takes. At the back of the cramped room, Elvis leaned against a scuffed upright piano, laughing at something his friend had just said. This wasn't the king yet, just a young man in a creased leather jacket, his guitar resting on his knee, eyes bright with the thrill of possibility. His friend, another up-and-coming musician, shared his dream. They spent nights swapping riffs, experimenting with rhythms, and talking about how far they might go. They made a simple pact: no matter where this goes, we stick together. And for years they did. The friendship survived long tours, radio fame, and the chaotic rush of screaming fans. They wrote each other postcards from opposite ends of the country. Elvis would call from hotel lobbies, the sound of chatter and clinking glasses in the background, just to check in. His friend would send back scribbled notes, always ending with "keep playing." Then came the phone call. The details differ depending on who tells it, but the message was the same. Something had happened. The voice on the other end was flat, hollow, A road accident, some said. Others spoke of sudden illness. What's certain is this: Elvis stood in that hotel hallway for a long time after hanging up, head bowed, hands in his pockets. When he finally moved, it wasn't toward the stage. It was toward the first flight back to Memphis. Witnesses recall him arriving at the family's modest home. No entourage, no cameras, just Elvis, carrying bags of groceries, stepping inside quietly. He stayed for hours, sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee that had long gone cold. Before leaving, he made a promise to the grieving family. "I'll make sure the world remembers him." The drive back to the airport was silent. In his lap, Elvis held a white silk scarf, folding and unfolding it without looking down. That vow would follow him for years, tucked away behind sold-out tours, film sets, and award shows. It waited, patient for the right moment. And on that night in Las Vegas, with a single raised hand, the moment had finally come. But no one, not the band, not the audience, was ready for what he would do next. The night after the funeral was quiet in Memphis. Porch lights glowed along the street, and the crickets outside seemed too loud for a house in mourning. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and fried chicken, brought over by neighbors. Elvis sat at the table with the family, the scarf still tucked into his jacket pocket. He wasn't the king here. No cameras, no security. Just a friend who had run out of things to say. He listened more than he spoke. The mother talked about the early days, how her son learned his first chords. Elvis smiled softly at that, looking down at his hands. At one point he stood, opened the fridge, and helped himself to a plate, like he always had. That familiarity was its own kind of comfort. Hours passed. Finally, as he rose to leave, he placed a hand on the father's shoulder. "I'll make sure the world remembers him," he said quietly. Witnesses recall his voice breaking on the last word. From that night forward, it wasn't just a promise, it was a mission. Years rolled by. Elvis's life became a blur of stages, airports and bright hotel suites. But every so often, in the middle of a conversation, he would mention his friend's name, to crew members, to bandmates, once to a reporter, though the story never made print. And yet, he never made the tribute public. Not yet. Backstage on that Las Vegas night, the atmosphere was electric. Ushers moved in crisp black uniforms, adjusting seat rows. Stagehands tuned guitars, the smell of solder and fresh wood polish hanging in the air. Elvis was unusually quiet before the show. Charlie Hodge, his friend and stage assistant, noticed it, how Elvis kept glancing at a certain spot in the stage layout. An empty seat in the front row, marked reserved. No name, no explanation. When the lights dimmed and the curtain rose, Elvis hit the first few numbers hard. Classic crowd pleasers, hips swinging, audience roaring. But somewhere in the middle, his gaze kept drifting back to that empty seat. Halfway through the set, the change came. The raised hand. The sudden stop. From the wings, Charlie leaned toward another crew member. "Something's coming," he whispered. Elvis turned to the band. His eyes gave the signal before his lips did. "We're changing course." This wasn't planned. The set list on the floor wouldn't help them now. And then Elvis did something no one expected, not even the band. He walked to center stage, microphone low, and let the silence stretch. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were seconds away from witnessing a moment that would never be repeated. The room was so still, you could hear the faint hiss of the amplifiers. Elvis adjusted his grip on the gold microphone, its cord coiling at his boot. Then with a tilt of his head, he gave the band a new cue, one they hadn't rehearsed. The drummer tapped out a slow, steady rhythm. The pianist, catching on, laid soft chords beneath it. The first notes of a ballad filled the air. Reportedly his friend's favorite song. A single spotlight narrowed to follow Elvis, turning the rest of the stage into shadow. The dust and the beam floated like tiny specks of ash. He didn't face the crowd, instead his gaze stayed fixed on that empty front row seat. His shoulders were square, but there was something heavy in the set of his jaw. When he sang the first line, his voice was lower than usual, almost as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. By the second verse, it was clear this wasn't a performance for applause. It was a conversation. Every lyric landed like it carried a private meaning, one the rest of the room could only guess at. Halfway through, he reached for the silk scarf tucked in his belt, wiping his brow before letting it rest in his palm. His hand lingered there for a moment, eyes closing as if steadying himself. In the shadows, the drummer closed his eyes too, swaying with the rhythm. The brass section stayed silent, letting the space breathe. Somewhere near the stage, a fan whispered, "Oh my God," but it was barely audible over the piano. By the final chorus, you could see it, Elvis's lower lip trembling just slightly. The notes stretched longer, his voice dipping into a rawness rarely heard in his shows. And the audience, they didn't move. No claps between verses, no shouted requests, just the quiet, collective understanding that something sacred was happening. The last line hung in the air, trembling at the edges. He held it longer than the sheet music called for, until it faded into silence. But it wasn't the song that broke the crowd, it was what happened right after. Instead of stepping back to the center, Elvis walked slowly towards stage right, his boots echoing against the floor. He kept his eyes on the empty seat, the scarf still in his hand. Every step seemed deliberate, like he was walking through water. The band stayed frozen, waiting for a signal that didn't come. And then, without looking at anyone, he hopped down from the stage, landing just a few feet from the front row. The scarf, still warm from his grip, was about to find its place. The spotlight followed him down. His boots touched the carpeted floor between the stage and the crowd. For a moment the only sound was the faint creak of the microphone stand above, swaying in his absence. Elvis didn't rush. He moved with a calm that pulled every pair of eyes in the arena toward him. The white of his jumpsuit seemed almost to glow under the low light, the gold of the scarf shimmering faintly in his hand. Fans in the front row leaned back slightly, as he approached, unsure of what was about to happen. Security stayed frozen. This wasn't in any plan they'd been given. He stopped in front of the empty chair. The seat cushion was deep red, the kind that had seen decades of shows. Tonight it had been left vacant on purpose. Without a word he unfolded the scarf slowly, letting the fabric catch the dim light. Then with both hands, he draped it across the back of the chair. The gesture was deliberate, slow enough for everyone to understand this was no accident. The air seemed to thin. Somewhere a camera shutter clicked. Elvis stepped back, just enough to take in the sight. He leaned toward the microphone still in his hand, and in a voice just above a whisper, said, "Some seats you never fill." It wasn't just a line, it was a truth that rolled through the room like a low tide. People who'd been holding their breath finally let it go. Some with a shaky exhale. A woman in the fourth row wiped at her eyes with a cocktail napkin. A man in the balcony dropped his chin to his chest. Even the ushers lined along the walls stood still, their ticket books at their side. From the back of the room, the applause began, not loud at first, but a slow building wave. It rose and fell, punctuated by the occasional sob. Elvis didn't bow, didn't smile. He simply placed his hand on the top of the empty chair. For one last moment, then turned and climbed back onto the stage. The band was waiting, eyes on him, unsure what song would follow. For the rest of that night, something in the set felt different. The tempo slower, the banter minimal. Every note seemed to carry the weight of that single, empty seat. And yet the night's most powerful moment had already passed. What no one in that arena knew, not the fans, not even the band, was that the tribute wasn't over. A week later something arrived in the family's mailbox. 7 days after that night in Las Vegas, a modest home in Memphis heard the sound of the mail slot clink shut. The morning light spilled across the hallway floor, as the mother walked over still in her robe. Coffee cooling in her hand. Mixed in with the usual bills and circulars, was a large, carefully wrapped package. Brown paper, edges taped with precision, no return address beyond a discreet postmark. Her hands shook slightly, as she carried it to the kitchen table. The father joined her, silent, watching. They peeled away the paper. Inside was a black guitar case, polished and heavy. The latches clicked open with a metallic snap, releasing the faint scent of new wood and varnish. The lid lifted. Resting in the plush interior was a custom acoustic guitar. Sunburst finish, strings gleaming under the overhead light, and tucked just beneath the neck was a folded note,
written in bold, unmistakable script. "You'll always have a seat in the front row, Elvis." The mother covered her mouth with her hand. Tears blurred her vision, spilling before she could even speak. The father reached out, touching the curve of the guitar like it was something fragile, alive. No cameras, no press release, no signature on the delivery slip. They understood instantly, this wasn't for the world. It was for them. In the weeks that followed, the guitar became a centerpiece in their living room. Displayed in a glass front cabinet, friends who visited would stand quietly in front of it, reading the note as if it were sacred text. Years passed. Seasons changed. The guitar stayed. Occasionally someone would ask if they'd ever told the press. The mother would shake her head. It was his gift, not a story to sell. And so for decades the only people who knew were family, close friends, and the few who had been there in the Hilton showroom that night. But the story never really disappeared. It lived in quiet retellings, at family gatherings, in the way the father's hand lingered on the cabinet glass, and in the eyes of the now grown children, who'd been too young to understand at the time. Some say the guitar was never played, not once. Others claim the father strummed it alone on rare nights, softly, just enough to hear the strings hum in the dark. What's certain is this: Elvis never spoke of it again in public, not in interviews, not on stage. The world moved on, but that single act of loyalty remained frozen in the family's memory, and for years it stayed hidden, waiting for someone to ask the right question.